Sophie Richardson and I, James Thompson, tied the knot right after college, following a 3-year relationship. Despite graduating the same year, I was 3 years older than Sophie because I had spent 2 years in the Peace Corps before starting school. Both of our families were thrilled with our choice of partners, but my mother-in-law, Laura, seemed to be the most excited. Laura was particularly overjoyed because she got to experience all the milestones of our engagement, wedding planning, and ceremony in a way she never had. Those were things she never got to do in her own life. She had gotten pregnant as a teenager and struggled as a single mom, especially after her deeply religious parents essentially cut her off. Then, a few years later, at 21, she married a much older man, Frank, for financial stability to help support Sophie. Laura had never known what it was like to have a romance, a real engagement, or even a big wedding. Frank, her husband, had been married before and preferred keeping things simple. While he was a decent guy who cared for both her and Sophie, he was as dull as dishwater and had about as much romance in him as a brick. I always liked Laura, mainly because she's only 11 years older than me. I never really saw her as the typical mother-in-law figure. To me, she felt more like a young aunt. She was just as pretty as Sophie, though about 3 inches shorter, with green eyes instead of Sophie's blue, and less sensual, I guess. Laura had this beautiful face that always seemed to light up with a radiant smile, and she was genuinely kind-hearted. Despite her looks, though, Laura was incredibly shy and dressed very conservatively. I always figured that was probably a result of everything she'd been through. Years into my marriage with Sophie, Frank passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack, though given his health habits, it wasn't a huge surprise. Laura took it pretty hard, so I helped her handle everything related to Frank's estate. I supported her as much as I could, trying to keep her involved in our lives and pushing her to focus on her charity work. The one thing she absolutely refused to talk about, though, was dating. There were a lot of guys I knew, some much younger than her, who were clearly interested, but Laura wasn't having any of it. Then, about 6 years into my marriage, I found myself facing the all-too-familiar scenario of being an oblivious husband whose wife had been deceitful. I may have been naive, but I wasn't clueless. Once I confirmed Sophie's affair, I moved out of our apartment and into a motel. I started going through her finances right away. I genuinely believed Sophie loved me, but she had lost her way. She didn't think her brief affair with someone she claimed meant nothing to her was a big deal. She told me I was overreacting. I knew she'd confided in Laura, and while I never called her mom, it was always just Laura. I knew she was asked to stand by Sophie. 3 days after I moved out, Laura came to visit me at the motel. I was caught off guard, but given how kind she'd always been and the affection I had for her, I invited her in. We sat down on the couch, and she took my hand in hers. "I'm so sorry, James," she said softly. "I know I didn't raise Sophie that way." I squeezed her hand, offering reassurance. "I know, Laura, you've always struck me as someone with strong morals. Sophie's actions have nothing to do with you." She had a tear in one eye as she replied, "I'm managing, but it's been tough." I nodded. "I'm fine. It was a shock, but I'm decisive. I dealt with it and moved out. I'll hurt for a while, but I'll get through it. Do you think there's any chance you could forgive Sophie and take her back? I don't know how to deal with this." I admitted, feeling the weight of it all. She thinks I'm overreacting and doesn't see the extent of what she's done. A tear slipped down my cheek. We spent the next hour talking, not just about Sophie, but about other things too. When Laura stood to leave, she hugged me much longer than I would have expected for a mother-in-law. As she pulled away, she looked me in the eye and said, "Seriously, James, I hope that your divorce from Sophie doesn't mean you're divorcing me too." I gave her a small smile and replied, "You'll always have a place in my heart, Laura." After she left, I felt oddly comforted, like I had someone who truly validated my feelings, without any pressure to make things right with Sophie. Laura was more like a true friend in that moment than just my mother-in-law. That is, until I woke up that night, drenched in sweat from a dream I'd rather not discuss. I filed for divorce a week after moving out, citing irreconcilable differences, and informed my landlord that I was no longer responsible for the rent. Sophie was absolutely upset, but I honestly couldn't figure out why. What did she expect? We had been together for almost 9 years, and I had always been upfront about who I was. Sophie and her lawyer tried everything, including counseling, which made the first few months a lot more complicated than I'd anticipated. I was in shock but stuck to my guns. I probably would have struggled more if not for the support of a couple of single friends who kept encouraging me. Laura also checked in with me every week, not just to see how I was doing, but to share positive stories from her charity work. We met for lunch once a month, and during those meals, Laura always seemed upbeat. But after about 3 months, we had a preliminary hearing scheduled for a Monday at 1 o'clock. Sophie asked for counseling, but my lawyer managed to shut that down with photos showing Sophie having lunch with her new friend Oliver at least twice since I'd moved out. Even though Sophie kept tearfully insisting that nothing had happened between them, the judge wasn't convinced. Her actions, or lack of distance, spoke volumes. He denied her request for counseling, and it was clear to everyone that this was likely the beginning of the end of our marriage, which seemed set to be finalized within the next few months. The very next day, Laura called me at work, which wasn't something that happened often, but I always welcomed it. After the usual pleasantries, she got straight to the point. "James, you probably know that Sophie called me yesterday, really upset. It looks like the divorce will be finalized in a few months. Do you think that's the case?" "Yes, Laura," I replied. "It's true. I'm really sad about it, but I have to keep moving forward. My lawyer seems confident that we can resolve all the financial issues, so I'd expect a final decision in about 3 months. I figured you might be feeling down, so I'd love to invite you out for dinner this Friday. It wouldn't be too awkward for you to go out with your soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law, would it? If you're uncomfortable, I can always wear a disguise," she added with a playful tone. I couldn't help but laugh. "No, that sounds nice. You don't need to wear a disguise, Laura. I just worry I might not be the best company. Don't worry about it. I'll make sure you enjoy yourself, and I know you'll eat well. I know cooking isn't exactly your strong suit, so what time should I pick you up?" I chuckled, realizing that her jab about my cooking skills was actually a roundabout compliment. "I can either meet you at the restaurant, or you can pick me up. But no way am I letting you treat me," I said. "No arguments. I'll pick you up around 7 p.m. "All right, it's a date," she said with a smile. That Tuesday night, I had another unsettling dream. If these keep up, I might need to see a shrink. But to my shock, and yet not really my surprise, when Laura showed up at my door at exactly 7:02 on Friday, she looked far more stylish than usual. She was wearing a chic, low-cut blouse, a short skirt, and 3-inch heels. Her makeup was on point, drawing attention to her striking green eyes, and her new hairstyle made her already beautiful face even more captivating. She looked much younger than 43, easily in her 30s. Laura seemed a little nervous as she checked me out. "Wow, you look amazing," I managed to say, my jaw almost falling to the floor. "Thank you," she said, relieved. "The restaurant is pretty upscale, and I didn't want to look out of place." "Is that a new outfit?" I asked. "Yes, I bought this and a few other things this week. I figure it was time for an upgrade." Laura had picked a restaurant with a dance floor, and as we drove, I noticed her skirt had hiked up, revealing more of her thighs than I'd ever seen before. I couldn't help but think how slender and fit she looked. The dinner was great, and Laura's energy and lively mood almost made me forget the divorce. But her drinking habits were a bit odd. She usually had just a glass of wine, but tonight she ordered a bottle for both of us. I rarely drank, so I had just 1 glass, but she finished off the rest after dinner. She urged me to join her on the dance floor, and while I had only danced with her a handful of times, at Sophie's wedding and a couple of times after Frank's death, I had never seen her this animated before. Back then, she'd always been a reserved, simple dancer, but tonight she was full of energy. After a few songs, we took a break, and she went to the ladies' room. I was sitting at the table when she came back, and I asked, "How did you get so good at dancing? I thought I was decent, but you were clearly better." "I've been taking dance lessons once a week for almost a year," she smiled. "Did I do all right?" "You were one of the best dancers here, and you definitely caught the attention of a lot of guys," I said with a grin. "Oh, I didn't notice that," she blushed. Just then, a guy approached and asked if he could dance with Laura. I was taken aback, realizing that people might think she was my date. Once I got my bearings, I joked, "It depends on what my mother-in-law thinks." The guy looked embarrassed, and Laura swatted my hand playfully. "He's joking," she said. "But since this is only our second date, I don't want to disappoint him, especially if some young woman steals him away. Thanks for the invite, but I'll pass. However," she added with a grin, "if he leaves me, I'm sure I'll see you again." She laughed, placed her hand on mine, and the guy kissed her hand before walking off. "You're quite the charmer," I told her. At that moment, the waiter brought over a Bloody Mary for Laura and a soda for me. I was about to ask what this was about since we hadn't ordered anything, but she cut me off. "I ordered it on the way back, but now I have a drink," she said. "And then let's hit the dance floor again." I'd never seen her drink anything stronger than wine, but she quickly knocked back the Bloody Mary. We went back to dancing for another 5 or 6 songs. Then Laura leaned in close and whispered, "I think I've hit my limit, both with the alcohol and the dancing. Can you take me home? I shouldn't drive. Maybe I'm drunk. I'm not sure," she added with a small laugh. "I've never been drunk before, but I don't think I can drive without hitting something." I got the car from the valet, while Laura went to the ladies' room. Then I drove her home. She lived in a cute, stylish house in a trendy suburb, about 8 miles from my apartment. "I could just take a taxi home," she said. But she kept chatting away in the car, repeating how much she hoped I had a good time and that I could forget about her cheating daughter, even for a little while. When we got to her house, Laura fumbled with her garage keys. I took them from her, unlocked the door, and helped her inside. After Laura closed the garage door and bolted it shut, she pulled something from her purse and handed it to me. "I thought you might like this as a reminder," she said, her voice soft. I looked down to find a small token, a piece of clothing she'd taken off earlier, something personal, though not quite as I expected. I wasn't sure how to react, but before I could speak, Laura suddenly looked at me with a different intensity. Her demeanor had changed, and there was a vulnerability in her expression that I hadn't seen before. "I've been feeling lonely," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I just don't know how to deal with all of this anymore." She stepped closer, and I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but another part hesitated, unsure where the line was between caring and something deeper. We stood there in silence for a moment, the air thick with tension. I could sense that she was in pain, that she was trying to open up in a way she hadn't before. It wasn't about the gesture or the physical actions. It was the emotional weight behind it. "I don't want you to feel alone," I said quietly, trying to offer some reassurance, even though my own feelings were complicated. Laura's eyes were filled with longing, but also fear, as if she wasn't sure how to navigate the complexity of what was happening between us. But right then, I was too drained both physically and emotionally to even think about leaving. She pleaded with me, "Please stay the night, James. I've never woken up with someone I loved before." "Love?" I thought, confused, but pushed that aside for later. As she rested her head on my shoulder, I drifted into a deep sleep. And that night, I remember having a series of erotic dreams. I don't usually remember my dreams, but this time, they stayed with me, vivid and clear the next morning. Every dream had me with Laura. And then the last one, well, it wasn't a dream at all. As I woke up, I felt something stirring below the belt, and that's when it hit me. It wasn't just a fantasy. "Thank you for the best night and morning of my life," Laura said with a grin. Her green eyes, bright and intense, locked onto mine. We talked easily, though I didn't fully grasp the weight of what had just happened between us. But deep down, I knew it would catch up with me sooner or later. She smiled, then suggested, "Let's take a shower together." She leaned in for a quick kiss, and I was tempted. "Sounds tempting," I replied, but before I could get out of bed, she pulled me back, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry I told you I love you," she whispered. It was our first time together, and I could tell this was probably her first time sharing a shower with someone. She seemed almost giddy about it. Later, Laura, dressed only in a short robe, was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, singing to herself with that infectious smile. It was a lovely breakfast. She looked so radiant, so carefree. Honestly, aside from my wedding and Sophie, it was probably the happiest I had ever felt. After breakfast, I insisted she go get dressed while I cleaned up. She slipped into some denim shorts, a blouse, and casual flats, and once again, I couldn't help but notice how young and fresh she looked. Her hips were wide, her figure effortlessly attractive. She drove me back to my apartment, and when we got there, she asked, "Maybe you could show me your place? I've never seen it." "Sure," I said. She seemed a little anxious, though I couldn't put my finger on why. We didn't take long to get to the bedroom, since my place was small. She sighed deeply, her hands resting on my chest. "James, will you please make love to me in your bed?" Her voice was soft, and her hands slid down my chest as she spoke. The mix of her vulnerability, sweetness, and our earlier connection made my body surge with desire. I somehow managed to undress her without tearing her clothes apart, though I didn't fare as well with my own. Buttons and boxers were casualties. Laura moaned, gasped, and whispered as I pulled her back to the bed, holding her close. We lay there, side by side, both of us smiling. "Did you enjoy it?" she asked. "Yeah, of course," I replied, but I was already feeling the weight of exhaustion. "I'm not sure I can keep up with this on a regular basis. I'm wiped out and my spine feels like it's going to snap." She laughed. I massaged her back, and she did the same for me. We must have been lying there for about an hour when she suddenly asked, "Am I ruining your plans for the day?" "I guess my plans changed after last night," I answered. "How about we go to the movies tonight?" Her smile lit up like a Christmas tree. "Actually," she said, "why don't you come over for dinner, and we can watch a movie on my big screen TV?" "Sounds good," I chuckled. "When should I come?" "How about 5:30? You can help me chop vegetables," she suggested. After she left, I was alone in my thoughts for a moment, and I couldn't help but question myself. What the hell am I doing? I asked myself. This is your damn mother-in-law. If Sophie finds out, it's all over. And Laura, she might be falling for you. Do you really want to hurt her? Even though she's the best woman you've ever met? I buried my face in my hands, muttering, "Oh, shit." Just thinking about what Laura had said earlier made my mind spin. It was a chaotic mess for the next half hour, but finally, I decided to just go with the flow for the weekend and figure it out later. My internal debate finally quieted down. Taking things as they came led to an unexpectedly great weekend. We had a blast cooking together on Saturday night, watched half a movie before moving to her couch for some private moments, and even made love in her bed. Sunday morning, we hit the health club she went to for a workout, then went hiking in the nearby wilderness. Later, we made love in the woods in the back seat of my car, not caring how sweaty we were. And after all that, we still had enough energy for another round in her bed on Sunday night. By Monday morning, I felt more at peace than I had in a long time. But that calm was shattered right after breakfast when Laura said, "James, we need to talk before you go to work." "James, can you please listen to what I have to say before you respond or ask anything?" she asked timidly. "This is really hard for me, and I just want to get through it without interruptions, okay?" I nodded, squeezing her hands. "Okay." After a long sigh, she launched into a monologue that lasted about 15 minutes, speaking clearly and steadily, hardly pausing for breath despite her obvious tension. She told me that she had loved me from the very first time we met, that I was the only man she had ever truly loved. Then she explained that a long-term relationship between us wasn't realistic because of her age, 11 years older than me, what it would do to her relationship with Sophie, her inability to give me the children I wanted, and the awareness that I might never feel the same way about her as she felt about me. Despite all that, she said, "I'll accept whatever you can give me. I'll always be here for you." I was stunned into silence. When she finished, she said, "Go to work. I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time." I kissed her deeply and then looked into her captivating eyes. "I've got a lot to think about. Please don't be upset if we don't see each other for a couple of weeks. I usually make decisions quickly, but this weekend it scrambled my thoughts. I need some time." She smiled, kissed me quickly on the lips, and playfully ushered me out the door. And it wasn't an exaggeration when I said my mind was a whirlwind over the next 2 weeks, whenever I wasn't fully absorbed in work or distracted by something else. My thoughts kept circling back to Laura, Sophie, the sex, the anxiety. Every night, I dreamed of Laura, of traveling to exotic places with her, cuddling, and in one particularly unsettling dream, having a dozen children together. I called Laura every day just to chat for a few minutes. She never pressured me, kept things light, until one day she casually mentioned that Sophie had asked if she was seeing anyone. You look the happiest I'd ever seen you. Mom. Laura hadn't said a word in response. 2 weeks later, I invited Laura over for dinner on a Saturday night, and she was eager to come. I didn't have anything planned, just wanted to see if we were compatible outside of the physical side of things. We ended up spending the night together, making love twice. I knew deep down I was falling for her, but the 11-year age gap and the fact that she was still my mother-in-law made it hard for me to make a decision. Our relationship survived the final divorce, though, and soon after, Laura took Sophie on a week-long cruise. When she returned, she told me the trip had done wonders for Sophie. Her anger toward me had almost completely vanished, and she seemed to understand the fault lay with her own actions. Did Sophie ask about your love life? I asked. After a long pause, Laura replied, yes. So, what did you say? I pressed, prompting another long silence. Finally, she said she told Sophie she was happy, but wasn't sure if it would last, and didn't want to introduce me anytime soon. Had a major shift not happened, I might have stayed stuck in my indecision for months, maybe even years. But by then, I knew I loved Laura. We were spending at least 3 evenings a week together, and we talked on the phone every day. Even though I'd been married to Sophie for over 5 years, my relationship with Laura felt more genuine. Yes, Laura had been inexperienced the first time we were together, but she'd changed. Now, she was not just experienced, but expressive, loving, adventurous, and full of energy. The tipping point came one Friday afternoon when Laura called me at the office. We planned to see a play that night, followed by some intimate time together. But she was in tears, begging me to come to her house immediately. I made it there around 3 p.m. When Laura opened the door, it was clear she'd been crying. She immediately threw herself into my arms. I held her for a few minutes, letting her sob on my shoulder before I carried her to the living room couch. Okay, tell me what's going on, I said, holding her hands. I swear I didn't plan this, she sobbed. I didn't know this was even possible. Please don't hate me. You can just leave if you want. I was completely confused, unsure of what she meant. After a while, I managed to calm her down, squeezed her hands, and looked her straight in the eyes. Stop. Just tell me what's on your mind, I said. I don't know what you're talking about. She sniffled, took a deep breath, and said, I'm 7 weeks pregnant. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. We had discussed the possibility before, and she'd shared how she regretted not being able to have children. I knew she tried with Frank, but hadn't been able to conceive. A few years back, after Sophie was born, the doctor had told her she probably wouldn't be able to have another child, though she couldn't remember the specifics. As I processed this shocking revelation, I was momentarily speechless. My eyes must have widened in disbelief. Laura, thinking my silence was anger or rejection, started crying even harder. It got so intense, I feared she might actually hurt herself. I gently cupped her face in my hands, looked deeply into her eyes, and said, I need some time to think about all this. Please, don't be upset if I need a couple of weeks to figure things out. She smiled through her tears, kissed me quickly on the lips, and playfully nudged me out the door. That night, my dreams were haunted by images of Laura and me together, traveling to exotic places, cuddling, and in one particularly unsettling dream, having a dozen children. For the next 2 weeks, I called Laura every day just to chat for a few minutes. She never pressured me, keeping our conversations light, except for one casual mention that Sophie had asked. You look the happiest I've ever seen you, Mom. Are you seeing someone? Laura hadn't said a word in response. 2 weeks later, I invited Laura over for dinner again, and this time, she was eager to come. I hadn't planned on it, but I wanted to see how we clicked outside the bedroom. We ended up spending the night at her place again, making love twice. I could feel myself falling for her more, but the age difference and the fact that she was still my mother-in-law made it hard for me to be certain about anything. Still, our relationship survived the final divorce. After that, Laura took Sophie on a week-long cruise. When she returned, she said it had helped Sophie tremendously, easing her anger toward me and helping her accept that she was to blame for her own actions. Did Sophie ask about your new love life? I asked. Laura paused before replying, yes. So, what did you say? I pressed. She paused again before telling me that she'd told Sophie she was happy, but wasn't sure if it was long-term yet, and wasn't planning on introducing me anytime soon. If not for a huge turning point, my indecision might have gone on for months, or even years. But I finally admitted to myself that I loved Laura. We spent at least 3 evenings a week together, talking every day. Despite being married to Sophie for over 5 years, my connection with Laura was far deeper. Yes, Laura had been a little inexperienced the first time we were together, but now she was adventurous, loving, expressive, and full of energy. The real turning point came when she called me at work on Friday afternoon. We had plans for the evening, dinner, a play, and some intimate time, but she was in tears, begging me to come to her house right away. I rushed over. Arriving just after 3 p.m., Laura opened the door, clearly upset. She rushed into my arms, and I let her cry on my shoulder for a while before carrying her to the living room couch. "Okay, tell me what's going on," I said, holding her hands gently. "I swear I didn't plan for any of this." She sobbed, her words coming out in broken pieces. "I didn't know this was possible. Please don't hate me. You can just leave if you want." I had no idea what she was talking about. I took a deep breath, finally managing to calm her down. I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Stop. Tell me what's going on. I really don't understand." She sniffled, took a breath, and finally said, "I'm 7 weeks pregnant." That was a bombshell I wasn't expecting. We had talked about the possibility before, and Laura had often expressed regret that she couldn't have children, knowing how much I wanted them. She tried with Frank, but it hadn't worked out. Years ago, after giving birth to Sophie, a doctor had told her she probably wouldn't be able to conceive again, though she couldn't remember the details. My mind was in a daze, and for a moment, I was too stunned to speak. Laura, seeing my silence, probably misinterpreted it as anger or rejection. She started crying so hard, I feared it might turn into something more serious. Then everything in my mind cleared. I realized I loved her more deeply than I'd ever loved anyone before. And I wanted a child with her. I didn't care about the age gap. It was time to make a choice, and it was clear what that choice had to be. I cupped her face in my hands, gently wiping away her tears with my thumbs. "Stop crying, Laura. I need to ask you something." I repeated it a dozen times until she finally calmed down. Then I asked, "Will you marry me and make me the happiest man alive?" It took her a moment to process what I had said. After I asked again, she finally understood, and a smile spread across her face. "Yes," she whispered, tears drying. We embraced tightly, and I whispered how much I loved her. She told me she had been the happiest woman for the last 6 months, and even happier now. Just then, we heard the front door open. "Mom, are you here?" Sophie's voice echoed through the house. We froze, like deer caught in headlights, as we turned to see Sophie walking into the living room. Her face shifted from confusion to shock as she took in the sight of us. "What are you doing here, James?" Sophie asked, her voice tight with surprise. I couldn't answer immediately, but Laura did, blurting out words she clearly hadn't planned on saying at that moment. "I'm 7 weeks pregnant with James's baby," Laura said, "and we're getting married." At first, Sophie's face held a faint smile, as though she thought it was some sort of joke. But when she saw the seriousness in my eyes and the way Laura and I were holding each other, her smile slowly faded. Her eyes glazed over, and I rushed to her, catching her before she collapsed. I carried her to the sofa where Laura had been sitting just moments before. Laura jumped into action. She quickly grabbed some smelling salts and a cold compress, using them to revive Sophie. When she turned to me, she said, "I think it's best if you leave before she wakes up." Then, with a hopeful smile, she added, "Can we go ring shopping tomorrow?" "Of course," I said, leaning down to kiss her deeply. "I'll give my tickets to tonight's performance to a friend. Just let me know when to pick you up tomorrow," I said. Another kiss, and then I left. I gave my tickets to a friend and his wife, who were thrilled to get them. As a favor, I even offered to babysit their kids for the night. But we didn't go ring shopping on Saturday. Around noon, Laura called to let me know that Sophie would be staying with her that night, and it might take the whole weekend for them to sort things out. I understood, and I told Laura I loved her. "We'll go shopping as soon as we can. Hopefully on Monday," I added. She chuckled before hanging up. "Hopefully, it'll be Monday." I didn't know exactly what Laura and Sophie talked about, but I was sure that Laura loved Sophie just as deeply as any mother loves her child. Despite Sophie's past mistakes with Oliver, they had been a team for years before I entered their lives. Laura assured me she had been completely honest with Sophie about her feelings for me, and that there had never been any romantic or sexual contact between us until she knew my marriage to Sophie was truly over. Laura understood the awkwardness of the situation for Sophie, but she needed her in her life more than ever. I had to give Sophie credit. Despite her sadness, she was genuinely happy for her mother, who had never experienced real love until me. Sophie was also excited about the idea of having a younger sibling. Although Sophie and I didn't plan to be close, I made it clear that I bore her no ill will. I promised to always treat her with respect, and I assured her that I hadn't meant to hurt her. I just couldn't help falling in love with Laura. One challenge we faced, if you could even call it that, was Laura's heightened libido, thanks to her pregnancy. She jokingly said she needed to make up for 2 decades without real sex. Who was I to argue? We had a pretty vigorous sex life until she was 8 months and 1 week pregnant, at which point we had to take a break until 2 months after Chloe, our beautiful daughter, was born. Laura and I were married in a simple ceremony 2 months before Chloe's birth. We showed Sophie the utmost respect, and she was even a bridesmaid at our wedding. Although I had forgiven Sophie completely, my approach to Oliver was a little different. After the divorce proceedings began, I tracked Oliver electronically with the help of a private investigator. When I discovered he was getting married, I sent his fiancée a detailed dossier about his relationship with Sophie and how it had ruined our marriage. I was satisfied to see that his fiancée left him within a week of receiving my letter, and he soon relocated to another city. After Chloe was born, Laura and I decided we wanted another child. We didn't consider another pregnancy for Laura, so we opted for an egg retrieval with Frank's financial support. We fertilized one of Laura's eggs with my sperm and hired a surrogate mother. When Chloe was 15 months old, the surrogate gave birth to our second child, a son we named Ryan. Now, both of our children are 5 and 6 years old, and my love for Laura only grows stronger every day. I never imagined a relationship could be so fulfilling or that we could maintain such a passionate, intense connection. Sophie, meanwhile, married a man we both liked, and she's expecting a baby girl next month. I've wondered about what kind of relationship her daughter will have with our kids, but honestly, I've stopped trying to figure it out. All I know is that Laura will love her granddaughter just as much as she loves our children. Laura seems to have an endless capacity for love.